Howdy, folks. Let's get right into it. For the unacquainted, you can call me Lou, and I plan on making a sci-fi first-person shooter. The previous two videos were all about getting the core functionality working for the player. The most complicated part of that core functionality being the back end of our spatial inventory system. We also have stats, stat modifiers, and a movement system that will, in time, try to take full advantage of Unity's physics system. The plan for this devlog was to try and turn these pretty paperweights into something that could actually do damage. Along with that, no shooter should be considered complete without those red barrels you shoot that then go kaboom. And finally, I took a look into adding consumable items such as grenades and temporary stat buffs. And in doing these three things, we have set the groundwork for so much more. Now, there are 100 ways you can cook an egg, so I needed to implement this with intent. In a way, I worked backwards and thought about armor and damage first instead of the guns themselves. The short version is that there are three key considerations for stopping bullets, and they are how big are bullets, how fast are bullets going, and how many bullets can the armor take before it breaks. But this being both a war zone and in the future, we also have to consider other damage types. Things like explosions, or thermal damage from lasers and fire, or EMPs that don't hurt you but instead damage your equipment, or just impact damage from either falling off a cliff or having a crate drop on your head, or other planets being largely toxic, irradiated, and unbreathable as best we can tell. What damage can be repaired in a mission? What damage will the player have to learn to deal with until the mission is over? What is the bleeding edge of technology in my world? These are considerations I had to come up with before really delving into the implementation of this topic. All of that is a lot, but I do have to start somewhere. That somewhere is getting basic shooting implemented. There are a few ways to accomplish this, and if you want more detail about how shooting in video games works, you can watch the video on screen after this one. For the scope of my video, however, I focused on ballistic weapons, guns as we traditionally think about them that fire a bullet, and implemented them as hit-scan weapons. I made it so the shot properly comes out of the barrel of the player's held weapon. This results in our previously implemented weapon sway even throwing the shot off, which is exactly what I wanted it to do. Procedural recoil was the next thing I added, which adds another rotation to our weapon sway based on a random number in a range of values. To make it so each weapon handles in a unique way, I offloaded the weapon sway and recoil variables into the weapon data instead of within the player's hands. From there, I added a dynamic reticle showing the current point of aim on the player's screen. This being the future, I imagine aiming lasers would largely be replaced by something like this, where it shows on your HUD rather than shooting laser out that other people can see. I then added lines to show how the weapon would recoil and locked the position of these on the first shot the player takes, and then unlock it when the player stops firing. This results in both a unique reticle for each weapon, as well as hopefully giving detailed information to the player in a hopefully simple to understand way. This isn't perfect. Weapons like the SMG would probably be better represented with a circle to show the limits of the bullets, but for weapons like the AR or pistol, which have a clear bias to one side, this works well. It will hopefully look good once gussied up with some art. I then added the ability to aim down sights to center the weapon's aim and reduce the amount of recoil. However, the weapon models I'm using aren't really made for it and can obstruct a large portion of your view. More on that later, though. Now that we're shooting a ray out of our gun, we need it to actually do something. I started with having it impart a force on objects with a rigid body, that way they get pushed around. From there, I created a damage interface to take in any damage dealt to an object. This allows us to generically call the damage function in a few ways. For now, I added a float with the object's health, and when that reaches 0, the die function gets called. It'd be within the interface's implementation that we also figure out how armor affects the incoming damage, if at all. This isn't on the player yet, because I'd like to get the correct hitboxes on the player first, but this can only be done once I figure out the whole animation situation. Again, more on that later. With ballistic weapons, we're dealing damage based on the mass and velocity of the bullet. I'm putting those in air quotes because since they're hit-scan weapons, they have technically neither as a physical property of the shot. Instead, they act as values for the damage calculation once they hit their final target. Ballistics, unlike other damage types, should be able to pass through certain objects and hit things on the other side. For this reason, I created a script to designate certain objects as penetrable, and gave them an associated density value. On the initial hit, we pass the hit's location and angle to the penetration script, as well as the mass and velocity properties of the bullet. After plugging the mass, velocity, and density of the wall into the following equation, we'll get what is the new velocity of the bullet if it passes through the object. If this is below the object's velocity threshold, currently the density times 100, the bullet stops. If it is equal to or above this threshold, we then make a new raycast based on the original bullet, but with the new velocity, using the original hit location and angle. The origin of this raycast is a slight nudge forward from the original hit position. That way it's within the collider of the object and thus won't collide with it on the way out. We also modify the exit angle based on the mass of the bullet, larger bullets having less deflection, and small bullets having a higher chance to careen off target. When this goes on to hit something else, it gets treated just the same as any other bullet thanks to the damage interface, meaning it can impart force, deal damage, or penetrate walls until the velocity drops to a point where it stops. Wall penetration will probably see limited use in most missions, but the place I think it'll shine most would be on combat within spaceships. Bullets and pressurized vessels in the vacuum of space aren't likely to get along, so using high-velocity weapons will probably result in a bad time for everybody on board. Even if you don't poke a hole in the side of the ship and start venting atmosphere, you're still very likely to poke a hole in something else just as important, like a fuel or coolant tank or various electrical systems. An important factor in this mechanic is the bullets themselves and how they get handled by the player. I created a new scriptable object to represent an individual bullet when fired, holding the three values I already mentioned: the mass, the velocity, and the damage type. I then created instances of this to represent each kind of ammo for each weapon: 357 Magnum for the pistol, 9mm Parabellum for the SMG, and 277 Curie for the assault rifle. This isn't an actual item. I feel like tracking individual bullets is a great way to clutter up your inventory. Instead, I created a new item data and inventory item type to represent a magazine that gets loaded with these bullets. I added a small UI bar to the magazine's item to show how full it was compared to the max value that can be contained within. I then added a new function to the multi-grid manager to return a magazine based on what kind of ammo is needed for the weapon we're holding. I reworked our basic reloading function to use this, and now we have weapons using the magazine items to hold ammo instead of a generic pool of bullets. It looks a bit funky for the time being, but UI and UX will be a task all its own in the future. From there, I needed to figure out how to make other kinds of weapons, derivatives of the original weapon script that do things other than standard hit scan shooting. Rocket and grenade launchers, flamethrowers, laser weapons, that kind of thing. As a happy medium, I decided to go and make a shotgun, which will still be a ballistic and therefore hit scan weapon, but with a very different method of firing in the form of a spray of pellets instead of a single bullet. I set the functions related to firing as virtual, meaning in derived classes I can override them. Instead of shooting a single shot, we fire a spray of pellets, each with a lower mass than a normal bullet, but in aggregate should deal a decent amount of damage. The balancing is kind of funky. I'm having trouble finding a happy medium between too strong and too weak, mostly due to the lack of damage fall off over a distance. I'll rework them in the future, but as a proof of concept for different firing scripts, I'd say the shotgun is done well. I should be able to do a similar kind of override for any other kind of weapon to change the projectile while keeping the other mechanics, like reloading, the same. As stated, no first-person shooter is complete without exploding barrels of some kind. In most games they're removable, but since I'm going through the trouble of trying to build a physics sandbox within the game, I decided to try and make them a little smaller and easy to push around. The mechanic of them detonating is loosely based on the fusion coils from Halo, in which they push other objects, then deal damage to them. If those other objects happen to be other barrels, this results in a much larger explosion radius, and thereby a bigger hazard for anything nearby. It was around this time that I implemented some particle effects to much more easily demonstrate what's happening, as prior to doing so it looked like things were just getting knocked around for no reason. I used the older version of the Unity particle pack and imported it straight into the project. I didn't use the new one because it wanted to overwrite some project settings. It took a bit to update the legacy shaders to those in URP, but the result will do for now. If anybody knows a good source for particle effects, hit me up in the comments. While the explosions and impact effects work alright, they aren't the greatest. Same for getting decals to work in URP. It looks like adding a normal map to them makes the entire decal projection area look wonky. If anybody knows a fix, it'd be much appreciated. As we approach the end of this development period, I started working on implementing consumables. Consumables are one of those things that every game implements entirely differently. I decided the method I'm going to implement them with is by having a secondary selection method where you press the Alt key and then scroll similar to selecting your weapon. Any item that is a consumable and in your chest rig is a valid option for selection, though as of right now you can only see what item is selected through the inspector. To use items you press G, and when that happens the consumable does its effect and then the inventory item is destroyed, entirely removing it from your inventory. Right now I've implemented two kinds of consumable, throwable grenades and personal temporary buffs. Other consumables like healing items and deployable tools will eventually get implemented too, but other setup will be required first before they become a reality. The last thing I did was update all the icons and models to be appropriate for the new items added, and I tweaked the background color of the player's inventory to be slightly bluer so that the gray items stood out more on them. And that brings us to now. Prior to getting well into this devlog, I had no idea what the next one was going to be about. But after getting weapons working, I figured the next step should be working on the actual gunplay. This is distinct from what I've done so far, as it focuses more on the sound and animation of weapons rather than their core functionality. I probably won't have nearly as much to talk about in the next video, since it'll largely be an artistic endeavor rather than a technical one, but only time will tell. The actual goals for next time will be making custom weapon models, textures, and animations to replace the asset pack I've been using, making first-person animations for walking, firing, reloading, and aiming down sights, having animations for the use of consumables in your offhand, such as throwing a grenade or using the buff item as an injector, and lastly, taking a crack at making my own full-body animations to replace the Mixamo animations, hopefully fixing the issues we had previously in regards to aiming while walking. I'd like to thank you all for staying tuned this long. If you'd like to support the project, be sure to subscribe to see each time I post an update. Liking and sharing the video also helps a ton to get the word out on this project. I hope you guys do well until next time. Auf Wiedersehen. Tschüss.